Hi, everybody. Yes, we are there for a presentation of PREMI3NS, the recently SecNumCloud, qualified offer of Sense, relying on GCP. And I have the pleasure to make this presentation with Adit, a senior architect from, no, not a senior architect, a senior staff software engineer from Google. We work for 4 years, I would say, right now.
Around that, yeah.
Yes, yeah. At least from the beginning of this project, we made with Adit the full life cycle of this qualification, from the beginning of architecture design, and yes, the target we just reached a few weeks ago. And what we will present with Adit is contains two parts, I would say. First, the security principles that are natively covered by GCP that Adit will describe. And I will present on my side the added value that is brought by Sense in the frame of SecNumCloud requirements, which is not necessarily a simple thing. So Adit, floor is yours.
Thank you. So starting with the way that security works at Google, it really starts with our security teams. We hire hundreds of experts. These are researchers and engineers who are working on making all these systems more secure. This is really in two parts. First, they're building security infrastructure that other teams are building on top of. So these teams might be building frameworks for service authentication. They might be building access control systems, and other teams are going to integrate their products on top of that. And second, they're looking to find and address gaps in different systems. This can be proactively in terms of a security review for a product launch, or this could be reactive in terms of penetration tests or detection and response for attackers in the system. All of these improvements that Google is making are directly improving PREMI3NS also. When we make changes to Google Cloud, when we're pushing changes, those changes are also made available to Sense. They're made available so that Sense is getting those same benefits that we have from the teams that we have. I want to talk also about what are some of the systems that we have that makes this cloud secure in a way that is by default. It makes it so that when teams are building their products on top of it, that these products are also secure. To start, at the hardware layer, Google has a custom designed chip called the Titan, which is similar to a TPM that has some additional features for data center management. When these chips are manufactured, they get specific identities. These identities are available to Sense so that when hardware shows up in the Sense data center, Sense is able to validate that this is authentic hardware before when it's installed into the system. And then only when it's actually validated as authentic hardware does it get the ability to join the production network and start serving traffic. Then every time the machine boots up, it goes through a measured boot process where starting at this chip, you have the different boot layers that are being validated. Only once that's happened does the machine actually have the ability to join the production network, to join the fleet of machines serving jobs, and only then can it actually access customer data. If a machine fails this, it is re-imaged, it goes to repairs, it might have part swap for failures. So this is really part of the core sort of the base of how the infrastructure is secured. And then all data that's in PREMI3NS, all customer data is encrypted at rest using AES 256. There's no customer opt-in required. It's something that happens by default. This happens really at the distributed file system layer. So when services put files on this file system, it gets encrypted. To manage this in a scalable way, we use envelope encryption. So these storage systems will create data encryption keys. They will encrypt the data using these keys, and then they will store those keys encrypted using key encryption keys. That rolls up into a hierarchy, and that hierarchy will end at a system inside PREMI3NS called key store. Key store is a central location for a central durable storage location for keys. So on one side, it's solving the problem of how do you durably and securely store information. That's hard because on one side you need to keep it secret. On the other side, if you don't want to accidentally crypto shred your data. And the second thing it does for us is it provides a central place for policy enforcement. For example, let's say we want to create a policy that everyone needs to rotate keys at some frequency. Because key store is the central place where everyone has their keys, that's the starting point for how we start enforcing those policies across the fleet. Talking about how the data is secured then as it moves across the network. The traffic from the internet is all terminated at front ends, and that traffic is coming in using standard protocols like TLS. It gets validated at those front ends and then is converted to internal protocols when moving within the PREMI3NS system. Inside, it's using a Google-designed application-level transport security protocol, which is similar to mutually authenticated TLS, but has some trade-offs from the fact that it's running in a controlled data center environment. For example, because we have more control over key rotation than you would out in the wild, we're able to make performance improvements using the assumption that the keys are going to rotate very, very frequently. This infrastructure is sort of ingrained into the frameworks on how software is built, so that it is much more difficult for someone to try to work around this, to try to get unencrypted traffic on the network, than it is to just use this. And as a result, you end up with virtually all service communication is secured in this way. And then finally, we want to bring this secure by default idea to operations too. And what this means is making sure that Sans has tooling that makes it so that actions that require broad privileges are rare. Let's take, for example, someone who's getting a shell on a system. That's a very broad privilege that lets them do almost anything. And we want to provide tools that makes it so that either instead of getting that shell, they're able to make an RPC call or take those actions via a proxy that has a pre-reviewed and pre-approved policy that makes it so that, in fact, they don't even need that access in the first place. And then that also makes it very clear to see when someone does take that access, it's a very small number of events that can be directly logged and tracked. The second part of that is that when there are going to be times when very privileged access is needed, these systems, they break, and then if they break in ways that breaks the tools used for access, you will need greater access to these systems. And in those cases, we need to make sure that the systems need to make sure that they are requiring multi-party authorization and that they're logging all access so that that can be audited at a later time as appropriate. So all of this that I just talked about is entirely transparent to customers. This all happens at the service layer. Sans sees it, Sans talks with us about it, but I want to talk next about what are the security products that we have available in PREMI3NS that you can use to actually secure your workloads.
Services that relies on all the security principles you mentioned there.
Yeah, exactly. The first, and I think most basic one is IAM. In terms of services, IAM is used to ensure that your permissions are locked down. For example, user X can only access service Y. It can also be used in more complicated ways. For example, you could put a tag on a number of resources and then require that only specific users have access to these resources tagged in this manner. Two other products that are in this area are identity federation, both workforce federation and workload federation. Workforce federation is used for people. So in PREMIONS, you will bring your own identity provider and connect that with PREMIONS. This lets you control directly who is authenticating to your resources. For workload federation, that's for services. It is used if you need to connect your infrastructure in PREMIONS with an on-prem environment or with another cloud. It will let you do that in a way that's a better practice, more secure than using something like a service account key. It's not required if you're authenticating within PREMIONS. So for example, if you have a VM, your VM needs to access a BigQuery table. You don't need any of the workload identity federation stuff. You would just give an IAM permission to your VM to access the table. Next, there's key management. Customer key management is based around Cloud KMS, Cloud Key Management Service. It has two main ways to use it. You can either use it directly, you can create an encryption key, encrypt your data, or you can use it to encrypt your data in other storage products using customer managed encryption keys. As we mentioned before, all data is encrypted by default using strong encryption algorithms. So this doesn't encrypt unencrypted data, but rather what this gives you is some additional control over the policies around that encrypt that data. For example, you could set a policy that requires that the key rotate with a certain frequency. Or you could use the next product, Cloud External Key Manager, to require that in order for PREMIONS to decrypt your data, it has to reach out to an external key manager, and you would see, for example, access logs in that key manager for whenever this happened. And the final area to talk about is network security. We have three major items in this area. The first is Cloud VPN, which is, I think, relatively standard if you needed to connect your networks in PREMIONS with, again, an on-prem environment or another cloud. You would use Cloud VPN to do that securely. The two others, there are Cloud Armor, which is a managed firewall product that contains a number of features like rate limiting and DDoS protection. It also has a number of pre-configured filtering rules that you could use and lets you define your own. You would use this if, for example, you were exposing a web app on the internet. You needed to make sure that that's secure in some manner. And then the last one is VPC service controls, which is similar to a firewall and extends that concept to resources that are in Google Cloud products. For example, let's say in a normal network, you have a firewall that says only services within the network can access this VM on the network. Even if you had, let's say, somehow credentials and you were outside the network, you wouldn't be able to access the VM. If you think about the way that a PREMIONS product works, like let's say BigQuery, normally if you have a service account key for a service account, you can access the data in that BigQuery table. With VPC service controls, you would be able to set a perimeter on that BigQuery table, be able to say that access can happen from inside this virtual network. So the result of that is that even if someone had your service account key, they would not be able to access your BigQuery table because that's inside the VPC perimeter. I think that's all that I have on the Google side.
Yes, that's all I did.
Continue with the Sans side.
So we'll keep a few minutes at the end for questions. So remind your questions, and Adit will manage them in a few minutes. Yes, I take the floor right now for discussing what is the other part of PREMIONS, because of course, on the basis of all these good and best practice security principles, even if we face there to a high level of security, it doesn't fulfill all the SecNumCloud requirements. And what I will present right now is the way we enriched all this technology in order to be sure that we fulfill the entire I would say, perimeter of SecNumCloud requirements. And I will cover that with 5 different facets. The first one is related to the what we call the partner space when we discuss with Adit, or what we call the, rather in ANSI documentation, the administration information system. Second part is linked to all the resources that we need to externalize or regionalize, I would say, in order to replace all the root of trust that are in the standard GCP technology located in US or at least outside the European Union. We'll focus also on the way we secure the customer onboarding, the way we perform the supervision of all these infrastructures, either the Google part or the Sense part. And finally, a focus on the operations that, of course, need to be high class for fulfilling, I would say, all our commitments. Yes, before I start, all the documentation on the services that has been, I would say, overviewed by Adit are available on documentation.sens.fr, of course. You will get all the details of the available services, and the security principles are also summarized in this online documentation. Yes, first point, the administration information system. As you can imagine, that's a kind of toll between the GCP world and the Sense world. By that, I mean that we have a strict and physical isolation between GCP world that, I would say, deploy software all over the world in the 42 regions, if I correctly remember, more or less. And in addition to these 42 GCP regions, we have one, and I would say rather 2 dedicated ones, which are the PREMI3NS regions that are also relying on Google technology, but are physically isolated from this GCP world, thanks to this administration IS that is really, as I would say, as a gateway, a unique gateway between the GCP world that orchestrates all the deployments in the world and our own solution. This admin IS was and is actually the only way to fulfill all the SecNumCloud requirements, 276, that especially talk about physical isolation, logical isolation, autonomy of operators, and all this stuff all these requirements can be fulfilled only if we build and operate by our own in a full autonomy this administration IS. That's the unique gateway, as I mentioned, between GCP and what we call the Trust Partner Cloud Universe. And I mentioned that because you will probably see this acronym a little bit later in the slides. In terms of requirements, ANSI SecNumCloud, as I mentioned, is a lot of requirements, almost 300. But these requirements also, I would say, pull additional guides, and I will make it in French in order to you are able to find them in the net. Le guide d'hygiène, which is mandatory for any IS in France, mandatory, I would say, highly recommended. Le guide d'administration sécurisée, that allows to get the list of rules that are, I would say, recommended or required for securing an administration information system. And also the guide des passerelles Internet sécurisées that explains how you will isolate all the traffic that must come from, I would say, a totally public world, which is Internet, into either a private one or a sensitive one, that will contain all the customers' data that need to be protected. And this physical isolation, this different definition of zone is very important in SecNumCloud and cannot be, I would say, fulfilled with GCP by itself. That's why we had to bring an additional component, which is the admin IS on top of that. And I would say that in this admin information system, we try to apply all the best practice that you saw for the GCP technology. As an example, all the servers, the hardware that we use for our administration IS, around 200 servers deployed in the 3AZ, get benefits from a measured boot relying on the TPM, meaning that we onboarded all our machines in order to be sure that the OS image that we build by ourselves are, I would say, has not been tampered before they are launched on our own system. We also made for our own operators mechanism which is similar to the IAM presented by Adit, which allow us to perform a fine-grained authorization for our operators on all the groups and services they are responsible for. So yes, the first, I would say, the first brick of that is very important in the sense that this value is this administration IS. And what I will cover right now is the different parts that we added in this administration IS in order to I would say, to complete the picture. The second one, introduced a few minutes ago, is the externalization and regionalization of root of trust. Adit were explaining a few minutes ago that all the keys, the encryption keys, were managed in a hierarchy. Data encryption key for your data, key encryption key for wrapping this deck, and all these decks, these encryption keys, are by themselves also wrapped in order to fulfill the requirements of isolation between the different tenants, between the different services, in order to be sure that the multi-tenancy is perfectly managed in this multi-tenant platform. And to do that, we had to externalize and to be sure that it doesn't raise any outgoing flows to United States, or at least outside the European Union. We had to externalize different root of trust. The first of them is the operator's identity. Currently, in all the GCP world, as soon as a Google SRE connects to TPC in order to solve any bug, it is authenticated through cloud identity. In the frame of Sense regions, that's a dedicated IDP developed and operated by Sense that is used. The second one is all the VMs that are used for connecting to TPCU in order to operate the GCP technology are VMs managed and orchestrated by the administration IS, and all these VMs are authenticated by TPCU itself in order to be sure that the people who are connecting to TPCU for operating it, are valid and well-known machines with, I would say, a measured OS. I was talking about the root of hierarchy of encryption keys, the symmetric encryption keys, the IES 2006 256, that has been mentioned by Adit a few minutes ago. They are backed by a service that relies on a qualified HSM in our administration IS. And we also provide for all the TPCU perimeter the TLS certificates that are used for securing all the access from internet to the TPCU API and TPCU user interface. These TLS certificates must be, in order to fulfill SecNumCloud, generated in European Union. That's why we use a European certification authority for that. And finally, all the mutual TLS communication we have between GCP services and SAN services, or SAN services and TPCU services. Actually, as soon as we need to interact with a Google service, either in GCP or in TPCU, we systematically implement MTLS, and all the related certificates are generated by your own PKI for ensuring, I would say, the property and the security of all these exchanges. The third pillar of this secure offer is the customer onboarding. If you join PREMI3NS, you will be, I would say, taken into charge by Sense team. That will ensure that you have, I would say, a good end-to-end journey. It relies on different points, not only technical one. The path I mentioned there, le plan d'assurance sécurité, is a very important document for us because it strictly mentions all the commitments of Sense against any customer. In order to be sure that we agree on the way the security is managed, in addition, I would say, to the SecNumCloud standard. And this path covers the contract, of course, all along its life cycle. The second part that we ensure in this journey is and that's a point that has been mentioned by Adit for the workload identity federation, it's the externalization of IDP. Contrary to what you can find in standard GCP, where you will probably or maybe use the cloud identity of GCP as a source of authentication, in the frame of SANS, if you want to fulfill the SecNumCloud requirements, you cannot use a resource that is outside EU. That's why, in the frame of PREMI3NS, the IAM located in TPCU is systematically integrated with your IDP. As a customer, you already have an IDP, generally an Active Directory or your preferred LDAP database, and that's this kind of identity provider that will be integrated with your IAM in TPCU in your tenant. The other part where we bring additional security is on the billing data. The billing data, of course, of this multi-tenant platform are, of course, shared and managed by Sense as an operator. But Sense must ensure the multi-tenancy of this data, exactly as your own data or your own workloads, by ensuring that all these billing data are confidential. And we manage internally a mechanism consisting in exporting all the consumption of SKU that you make in PREMI3NS in a dedicated BigQuery dataset that you can use by your own in your tenant for your FinOps operation. And the last point I mentioned on that relates to the customer's tickets, of course. As the rest of our platform, this customer's ticket is also a multi-tenant offer that ensures the confidentiality of all these tickets, because we can imagine that some tickets, especially in the frame of debug, can contain confidential information that cannot be shared even with other customers. A very important point in terms of SecNumCloud, the supervision of infrastructure. You already maybe followed a conference that has been managed by Romain Bréchet or Saizo and Simon Maréchal, our inspectability expert, on the way we perform the inspectability of all the PREMI3NS infrastructure. So I will not go in this kind of detail, but what I want to mention there is that in the administration information system, we collect all the internet flows, either incoming or outgoing. And of course, these flows are not, I would say, kept as is because they are encrypted. So what we do, we collect on all the fibers connected to internet through optical taps, all the headers, all the IP packet. We just keep the headers of the IP packet thanks to data brokers, and we store that in a CM where we analyze a lot of information in order to I would say to detect any potential I would say deviation between what is expected by SecNumCloud. I mean, no flows outside European Union, in order to potentially warn customer if something seems wrong to us. And after this analysis in CM, we also send information to the PDIS SOC, which is I would say responsible for performing a second level of detection and analysis of all the flows. In addition to all this internet IP packet, we also collect all the sensitive activities of the TPCU control plane, management of keys, for example, internal flows between customers. We also managed the OS of our administration terminal, thanks to an EDR. We also use a dedicated security analysis probe, which is qualified by ANSI. So this overall picture ensures that, at least it has been validated by auditors and by ANSI, that we have the appropriate coverage of all the flow, either external or internal, that allow us to be confident in the promise we make to our customer, which consists in ensuring their confidentiality. The last point on operations, and that's also a SecNumCloud requirement, a sense must have a wide autonomy in its operation. Autonomy means that all the level 1, all the level 2 problems that we can encounter on GCP technology are managed in full autonomy. Nevertheless, as I would say authorized by SecNumCloud, we can get support from Google, and that's why we put in place some specific mechanism that help us in getting support from Google without letting them a direct access to the platform. They do not have access to a keyboard. They do not have access to a platform. They have access to a screen sharing that is managed by Sense Operator in order to get the appropriate support. That's what we call the guided session. And in a very rare case that are also authorized by SecNumCloud, which we limited to all the disaster recovery, we have a dedicated mode which is named the escorted session, where a Googler can have an access to one of our terminals, but is always under, I would say, the control of a Sense Operator that can cut the session at any point if he considers that there is too much risk on confidentiality of data. In addition to that, this autonomy of Sense must bring security. That's why we perform the supervision of all the admin access through a dedicated VPN, relying on IPsec. We perform an authentication of people, of administrators, and we perform, as for our server, the remote attestation of terminals that are used for the administration. So by this way, we consider that we have the appropriate level of security for connecting to the platform, and the experience shows that we are in GA for since October last year. Experience shows that we get the appropriate level of autonomy for level 1 and level 2. And I would say that's it. Do you have any questions after this quite long presentation and tiring because in English? You can, yes.
You mentioned mentioned encryption at rest, encryption in flight. Are you looking into encryption in use, specifically confidential computing?
It's something we are looking into, and something that I think we are. I'm not sure where it is in the roadmap, but something that we are working on bringing to the cloud.
Yes, product team would be most appropriate. But I saw recently that the confidential compute will arrive in wave 3, which normally should be arrived before the end of this year. The wave 2 is in June, and wave 3 in December. Yes, you can do for
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
the single sign-on on IAM, if I correctly remember.
Yeah, so the way that this it integrates either using OIDC or SAML to your solution. So it relies on those systems to authenticate with the user, and then what the PREMI3NS system gets back is effectively a claim saying that this user authenticated, they have these attributes, please allow them to access the system, and then how you configure that to map to your resources is something you would do in Cloud IAM.
You will get the same experience in PREMI3NS than in GCP for this part, actually. The IAM ensures the SSO, and the main difference is the underlying IDP, which is necessarily yours in PREMI3NS. It cannot be the cloud identity that you could use in a standard GCP. But the rest of the user experience is the same. To suspend the services? You mean the use case you have in mind is a kind of embargo, something like that? Okay. Yes, that's also one point that must be covered by SecNumCloud. Actually, as mentioned by Adit, our region is synchronized on the rest of GCP world, meaning that we get, I would say, a continuous flow of updates, either of binaries or related configurations. But if, for any reason, any decision or any geopolitical issue, Google stops the update of our platform is still there. Platform still running. Platform, of course, won't be patched anymore. That's why, in this case, we should be, I would say, more accurate in our analysis and detection of potential security breaches. But the platform remains as is, so it will go on working. So we cannot say it will last forever, because of course underlying hardware will get failure. Maybe we'll get bug in software that cannot be patched anymore. But that, I would say that we will encounter exactly the same kind of issue that you would have in a system that is not very regularly, I would say, updated or I would say maintained in terms of hardware. So be sure that that's something that we have in mind, of course, and that's also covered by SecNumCloud. Auditors and ANSI considered that we were bringing, I would say, enough guarantees on our ability to maintain the service for enough time, allowing any customer to retrieve data by exporting them from their tenant and put them where they want. So that's the way we manage embargo, actually. Okay? Yes?
Quick question on identity. So right now we only have a single solution, which is Workforce Identity Provider, which means that the customer has to bring his own IDP. Will there be some kind of break glass procedure so that if my IDP fails for some reason, get another kind of access. I mean, on GCP, you can have your own IDP and Google identities, for instance. So if one fails, you get the other. Is there something in the roadmap down the road that would allow us to secure our access?
Under your control, I did, but I would say that solution is already on the table because in IAM, you can configure the workload identity federation by integrating one or two or n IDP, meaning that you will have your primary IDP, and if for any reason this one crashes, you have the ability to configure a second and a third one in order to cover this kind of fallback scenario. And on the other hand, yes, that's under responsibility of the customer, yes. But on the last point I would like to mention is that if you decide to have a fallback on a Google Cloud identity, you will break by yourself the SecNumCloud requirements. So generally, our customers have two different IDPs, primary and a backup, or maybe two different IDP providers, because there are a lot of IDP providers on.
No plans to allow customers to keep using the onboarding IDP as a fallback, for instance, or
the admin actually the onboarding IDP is used once for authenticating and onboarding the customer's administrator. That who will be the main administrator of the tenant, and as soon as this administrator is known in the tenant, he will manage, thanks to the IAM, who can administrate data, who can and manage the granularity. But all this authentication relies on the one or more identity providers that has been integrated with Workforce Pool Identity Federation. Yeah. Yes.
Follow up from the previous question, because, for example, if you have your IDP, even through like you configure like several of them, there's a network failure between Sense and the on-premise IT. That means you won't be able to connect with the IDP. You won't be able to. There's no way to have like a breaking glass account, a real one.
But
like, we work without any external.
if I correctly understand what you mean, if I correctly understand what you mean, the outage you mentioned is internet.
Not the internet, but the connection between Sense and your IDP.
Yes, but between Sense and my ID, between PREMI3NS and your IDP, there is internet, maybe a VPN that you put on top of internet in order to reach PREMI3NS, and you can configure different IDP. A second one always available through internet. So, what is maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I misunderstand. But the problem you mentioned there is if you cannot reach your first IDP, your primary one, you will fall back to the second that is available through internet. So the only way to avoid reaching it is to break internet.
For the first case, that's the other way around. I want my IDP to only be accessible for a private link, like for the
yes.
Connect or something
Yes.
like that. So that means my IDP is not directly exposed to internet. So in that way,
yes.
it's only a private connection.
But this private connection is a partner interconnect or a direct interconnect, or VPN that you put in place between your premises and PREMI3NS. Okay. So yes, if you have one only connection of this type, of course, if it fails, that's over. So you will have to put in place at least two connections of this type, or use an HA VPN that we natively have on PREMI3NS in order to ensure the high availability of this flow towards your premises.
Yeah, my first question was about if there's because, for example, I have a restriction. I cannot have like a public IDP, so it's only private. Can I still have like not backdoor? That's why that's a breaking glass. I mean, if there's an internal issue with the internal network on my enterprise, and I still need to access the console some way to.
So I think there's two parts, and one of them I have an answer for, one of them I don't. So we should figure out for the second part how we solve that for you. But if you have an internal IDP that you don't want on the internet, our recommendation for that is using SAML. because that lets you, as long as the client has network access to both the console and to your IDP, they manage the communication of those tokens so that there's no direct connection between the cloud and your IDP. The second one is if your internal IDP is having problems, how do you still access PREMI3NS console? That is, I think, something we should take back to our product team to understand what they can do with that and how we can better solve that. Because it is certainly a thing that we can let you manage multiple IDPs and create multiple backups yourself, but it's also something that we could also look at doing better.
And maybe a last point that we could bring to your reflection is, if the second IDP is an IDP, a kind of a keycloak or something similar, deployed directly in PREMI3NS, you won't access internet. You can reach it locally, I would say, not directly, but through the meet me room of the DC, and it should work, I would say. It would bring a kind of break glass mechanism, relying on an IDP that you manage by yourself in your tenant. It will probably work. Yes.
So basically, for a client connecting to its GCP, we have three types. We have the VPN, we have the partner interconnect, we have the cloud interconnect. For SaaS, we only have the VPN connection.
No, currently we have the partner interconnect, and you can put on top of that the VPN. We have the two different levels of services. And all the available services are I would say, listed exhaustively on the documentation.sans.fr that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So you will get all the information, and you will also, in these very interesting pages, all the key differences between what is supported in these services in PREMI3NS and what is natively supported in GCP. It's a little bit different because in GCP there is, I would say, the weight of legacy. In PREMI3NS, Google engineering only, I would say, ported the last feature. I would say the long run features of the different services. That's why sometimes you do not find all the features of a given GCP project in PREMI3NS, because they are considered by Google product as legacy ones. That's over. Thanks a lot for your attention.